What's up, family, and welcome back to the channel. I hope you're having an absolutely fantastic day because today we're going to have a very different conversation. I know I say that every time, but I mean, honestly, they are different conversations. But this one is really different. Today we're going to be talking about money. And while I have talked about finances on this channel before, not very much, which I will do some more. I've primarily talked about my journey and some critical thinking issues that I had in the financial department. Today, I want to have a conversation about megachurch money. I want to share with you a little bit, some from my insights and some from some recent sources that I found that I have every intention of providing in the description if I forget to provide it in the descriptions, because most of the times it's all copy and paste. Please let me know in the comments if you don't see it, and I will update the description to include it because I do have the sources in my notes. And for this one, I definitely wanted us to have the sources for it. So before we jump into this conversation, you already kind of know the routine. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit that alert notification bell. Look for a way to get connected to this community because there are so many ways and we need people like you. And also, we have really, really dope merch. So check that out and see if you find something that floats your boat. All right, so let's jump into this conversation. Today, we're talking about mega church money. Doesn't that just seem like a lottery ticket, like one of those lottery games, like somebody's going to win the mega church? Don't they have like mega ball or something? Mega church money. But no, we're actually going to have quite a nuanced conversation here. And again, I'm going to share some from my insights of working with, serving in mega churches, but then also some things from some statistics that will help us get a better view about this conversation. And I'm doing this for a few reasons, but instead of me just kind of saying them in the forehand, let's see if you can intuit them as we just kind of run through some of this. So in order to have this conversation in a way that's somewhat practical and grounded and not just ethereal up in the air somewhere. Oh, why did that remind me of Evanescence? Yeah, I can't even remember the song now, but anyway, um, yeah. So in order to kind of ground us in this conversation, I wanted to use a specific church, one that I could find some specific numbers on to help us get an idea. And so we're going to be using Elevation Church from I want to say they're in North Carolina. They may be in South Carolina. I'm not sure. They're in one of the Carolinas, but Elevation Church, they might be in both of them. Sorry. Elevation Church, we're going to use them as a case study. They have about 26,000 members according to their website and about 547 members of their staff. And that would, of course, be paid staff. They'd likely have somewhere between, I'd give a rough estimation, about 5,200 volunteers outside of the 547 staff. But as of 2023, the church their church brought in $108 million in revenue. That's $108 million in revenue in 2023. And just to kind of make that make sense, that 108 million would have come in over the entire year and would have been a combination of factors. Of course, the primary pipeline for that money would have been the tithes and offerings of members, also in visitors. And I think that's something that that people overlook, because many times you have visitors who will pop up at your church and give more than the members do, and that's quite. It's actually quite an interesting statistic because pretty much in every church service, whether unless it's dying or just started, there's always a healthy amount of members and visitors, and so there's less information on who those visitors are, which is another reason why churches make excellent money laundering vessels. That's another story. And I am writing a fiction novel about it called The Laundromat, but it's going to take me a while to get that one done. All right, so 26,000 members are plus an unestimatable amount of visitors. Also, likely gifts from other guest speakers. That's a major thing. When speakers come in and preach at your church, sometimes they'll give you or they'll give your church an offering. And there is a difference between them giving you an offering and them giving your church an offering. In the same way, there's a difference then when people are giving to their church and them giving to their pastor. People can give to their pastor is typically called a love offering. It does have to be filed a certain type of way, or at least as far as internal records, it does have to be filed separately from the typical tithes and offerings and things of that nature. But other than that, the tithes and offerings legally cannot go to directly to the pastor. And in most mega churches, the pastor is so far removed from the finances of the church till it's pathetic. He's just the fundraiser, and outside of the lavish, hey, get me a jet thing, which even sometimes those are even taken out of proportion because it's marketed as though this pastor got up in front of his members on a Sunday morning and said, give me a jet. And in many times what it is, it's a video. I think that was the case with Creflo. It was a video to his partners, which are typically people who give in excess of 100,000 a year to his ministry anyway. And so, but then the narrative becomes, oh, he's getting his members of his church to pay for his jet. And nope, it's the partners of his ministry. So that's a very different thing, and it exists in a very different territory. But so those are just a few places that the church revenue could be coming from, the tithes and offerings and the members. There's some other things that the church revenue could also be coming from that we'll kind of highlight a little bit in more detail when we get to the pastor's compensation. But that's typically like book sales, merchandise sales, music sales. Any of those things will also contribute to revenue. And if you do have, and mega churches are typically, unlike our, local traditional church, are typically operational 20, I don't want to say 24/7, but nearly around the clock, in the sense that there is a staff that's at the church Monday through Friday. There typically are other activities going on the campus, and there's typically community activity as well. And so in those mega churches, those larger churches, there's a lot of daily community activity, a lot of hallway traffic day to day. And so in those churches, unlike your small to medium churches, those bookstore revenue, coffee shop revenues can be quite significant as well. All right. Now, as a general rule, churches are financially supported by about 20% of their membership who are regular contributors, with roughly 2 to 5% of those 20% representing what we'll call angel donors. And those are typically your high earning professionals, your high profile politicians, your celebrities, or your local business people. And so those people are typically in a lot of mega churches. They treat them in the same way that any other fundraising organization does. Like they invite them into a separate circle type of thing. I think Bishop Jakes calls it the Bishop Circle or something. But it is very typical, not even just in the urban churches, not just in the black churches, even in some of the traditional churches that are large. They typically do the same thing, and it's just like, hey, a special thank you. You get a dinner with the pastor or something, and we take your grievances a little more seriously because hey, you're paying the bills. But that's kind of how that went. And this idea of 20% supporting isn't restricted to churches. You'll find this to be pretty consistent amongst most nonprofit organizations that are supported by donors. And that's probably best. Well, yeah, that's still nonprofit, because colleges typically follow along those same type of rules. It's 20% of their alumni who are contributing. Sororities and fraternities is 20% of their members who are really, carrying the weight. And that typically isn't just restricted to finances either. It's typically about 20% of the membership of the church who are actually committed to volunteering. And so there's a little bit of nuance there. Now, mega churches do normally have boards, have two boards to manage financial affairs and decisions. They have what we'll call, for lack of better words, an internal board of members to oversee the financial activity of the church. Churches that are a little less formal have foregone the idea of an internal board. And so they have an internal management team. And so that's typically just the executive leadership team of the church, who very much, functions like a board. The only difference in those cases for the churches that move that direction is the senior pastor is the default chairman of that board and has all veto ability, um, which that's a whole nother other conversation. But either way, it still operates in the same way, because even in the sense of the internal board of members, the goal is to oversee the people and the financial activity of the church. So in your older churches, this may be the deacon board, but basically the big point is that everybody that's on this board has to be a member of the church, and that's typically governing things that are under the pastor's purview. The other board that all mega churches that I know of have is an external board, and that's typically an external board of professionals, primarily other pastors, typically other mega church pastors. Sometimes they are a little less classist, a little less class restricted, and allow other people to be on the board regardless of the size of their church. But not only are megachurch are other pastors on this board, but typically bankers, lawyers, things of that nature. Um, and these people exist to monitor and approve financial compensation and disciplinary actions of the senior pastor if such case arises. And so, when you if you kind of reflect over the news, and you can always kind of tell which ones are and which ones aren't, and then you also have to um, draw a line of distinction between megachurch pastors and teleevangelists. So you have certain people who are megachurch pastors, which means they pastor a congregation. They have a board that they're accountable to for the most part, and that board is probably their friends or whatnot. But a televangelist who has a mega following is a different type of beast. Now, they still typically have a board too, but that board is not as interested in the local community because there is no community. So that board is more so about the staff. And that's when you're dealing with people like Benny Hinn, Joyce Myers, those people who travel from place to place, not necessarily having a place to lay their head, or a place to govern. And outside of Joyce Myers, the people who take the televangelist route are normally the healing people, the healing and deliverance people. And there is a real foundational reason for that, and that is because you can't be the healing person and stay in one city. Because if you heal everybody in one city, then next week you're going to find out who didn't get healed, and you're going to have to answer to that. So that's why the healing folks are typically the televangelists, because they never have to answer to um, the backlash. All right. So, but if you do kind of look back over the news over the past 20 years, anytime you hear of a scandal with a megachurch pastor, all of a sudden, if you've never heard of one before, you hear of this board who has said, hey, these are the steps that are going to be taken. Whether this person will be restored or not, here's the steps they'll have to take. In the meantime, this is how the church will be running, and so that is typically how that goes, which is why, and I'm not saying, I'd say mega churches are safer than smaller churches, all things being equal, because there isn't that type of oversight in those smaller churches. And in that sense, which I remind people that many cults that were built typically started as very small, isolated movements first, where you have this core group that wraps themselves around this identity, that almost becomes godlike, and then that core group goes out and does the recruiting. That the cult like figure doesn't have to do that anymore. And unfortunately, that happens more so with the small churches than it does the large churches. Not saying that it doesn't happen in the large churches, but it is definitely in lower numbers. So when it does happen in the large churches, it's not just one person doing something, it's a conspiracy, because several people had to be involved, several people had to be in the know. And in that sense, I'd advise us to no longer kind of look at church with this idea of they're supposed to be better than other people, and instead look at church, all churches, whether they're small or big, look at churches as organizations that people are a part of. So anything that happens, I don't know any people organization that's exempt from people corruption. And so I don't necessarily expect the church to be exempt from that. And I find that to be a dishonest charge, honestly. But all right, so let's kind of walk this through. We've talked about 108 million in revenue. We've kind of talked about how many members they have. They have 26,000 members, and that's typically spread all across the state, amongst some other places. And they do have some very high-profile members who are contributing to that 108 million as well as bookstore operations and stuff like that. Let's kind of break down how money works in a megachurch. So we'll start with kind of like the typical expenses. The biggest expense of a megachurch is typically what I like to call campus debt. And if you're a megachurch, unless you've just been, unless you've been at it for at least 2 decades, you have campus debt, which is basically the mortgage on the building you have. And for mega churches, it's typically more than one building, sometimes more than one location, and acres and acres of land. So you have that debt, but then also you have the worship center that's there, and that includes the worship center, the educational facilities, the fellowship hall, the children and youth centers, cafes and bookstores, which I mentioned, sports and recreation facilities, which and many campuses also have outdoor spaces such as gardens, playgrounds, and sports fields for various activities and events, as well as parking and transportation, large parking areas, and sometimes shuttle services, because many mega churches not only offer shuttle services to and from the church throughout the week. Some of them have taken that extra leap of actually offering their members those same shuttle services to get to other public places, which typically works best in cities where there's already an established transit, because then those churches just can kind of just use the same bus stops, if you will. And that's just because those stops have typically been thought out to be central to high traffic areas or places that people need to go. Let's see here, and so for Elevation, who we're doing our case study on today, for them that represents around 20 million a year. So for about 20 million a year, they spend on their campus debt. And then so the next one is staff payroll, and I said campus debt is one of the biggest. Staff payroll is typically the biggest. And that's not just of mega churches. Again, that's for the majority of nonprofit organizations. Salaries and benefits for staff are the largest expense category, often accounting for 40 to 55% of the church's budget. This includes compensation for pastors, administrative staff, worship leaders, and other full-time and part-time employees. For example, Elevation Church allocates about 34% of its revenue to personnel expense, which means they actually pay their entire staff 34%, well, not 34%, but 6% less than the low end of the average. And that equates to roughly around 34 million. So $34 million is spread among, I think we said about 547 employees. 547 employees. I wish I would have done the math on that, because I would like to see how that kind of works out across different levels. And then there's also ministry operations. Another significant portion of the budget is dedicated to operating expenses and funding ministry programs. And so this can range from 25% to 33% of the total budget. And these costs cover utilities, office supplies, program materials, and costs associated with running various church activities, which are typically community based activities for those type of churches. They do fall festivals, community fest, back to school giveaways, and stuff like that. For Elevation, that was $25 million in 2023. There's also outreach events. Many megachurches dedicate a portion of their budget to outreach efforts and missionary work, which can account for approximately 10%, 10 to 15% of the budget. Elevation Church spent about 13 million on outreach in 2023, so coming right in the middle of around 13%. But as you can see, these numbers quickly add up. I want to hit this next one right before hitting the big one, which I think is going to be surprising, and that's going to be pastoral compensation. But before we get there, there's also media tech. And with the rise of digital platforms and the need for virtual engagement, many churches invest in technology for streaming services, website maintenance, and other media-related activities. And this can be a growing expense as churches expand their digital presence. And I can for once say for sure, when it comes to these mega churches media teams and their tech teams, wow, a lot of them are incredibly impressive and goddamn it expensive, and that's a very interesting thing. But I kind of wish colleges would take that route, because for their arts programs. But yeah, so all right, so let's hit this pastoral compensation, which this is the biggest thing. So oftentimes when we're talking about mega church money, our mind is typically going to the place of talking about how much do these mega churches make, or how much do these mega church pastors make. And typically what um, switches our gears to that place in the conversation is the house they live in, the car they drive, or if they ask for a jet. These things, along with thinking like, wait a minute, you're getting all this stuff tax free, it just doesn't sit well in the public eye. But one of the many reasons that I wanted to have this conversation, and the other reason will become clear in a few, is because I want to make sure that we are being integral when we're engaging this conversation. Because this is why it's likely why it's not sounding the alarm you think it should be for other believers. Because for those believers who are members of those churches, especially for those that have been a part of those churches for a while, most of them know how much their pastors make. Most of them know how the things operate in their church. Most of them know where their pastor lives. Most of them know what their pastor drives. And so you're not really giving them any information unless you can, highlight a reason for them that pastor may not deserve those things. And of course, as I walk through the kind of way that money flows in a mega church, you can see it's not as cut and dry as people like to think it is. I think the idea that we have is that these mega churches are very authoritarian, and in many senses they are, especially on Sunday morning and Wednesday nights, but that's because you're talking to the volunteers. You're not dealing with the board, and so it's a whole different situation. But here we go. Let's jump into pastoral compensation for your mega churches. So the average salary for lead or senior pastors at mega churches typically ranges from 100 to 140,000, with total cash compensation, including housing allowance, reaching as high as 265,000 in some cases. However, of course, these salaries can vary widely based on church size, budget, and location. But there you have the average. The average is 100,000 to 140, but just to be gracious, 100,000 to 265,000 a year. Now, that's the average of megachurches. And already I think I've let you know before that megachurches represent a minority of churches in America. I know it seems like they are everywhere, but they are actually not. It's just there's just that many damn churches. But the megachurch represents less than 5% of that, and it's actually less than 5%. I just don't want to. I don't want to go under too. I don't want to undersell it too bad. But I do know that it's less than 5%, somewhere likely between 1 and 2. But again, I don't want to undersell it. And then, of course, even in that, the definition of what a megachurch is constantly in flux. For some people, it's 1,500 to 2,500 members, which then at that moment, that salary range, or 15, you know what, let's just do this, 1,500 above, But if you see if it's 1,500 above, and then you have people out here like Furtick and Jakes and Bryant and Osteen. Furtick has 26,000. Osteen, 10 years ago, it was at 60,000 members. You can see how that can be a fairly large gap. So we also know that as far as the high end salaries, they can be on the upper end of 400,000 annually. And these higher salaries are often seen in churches with larger budgets and higher attendance, typically over 10,000 attendees per weekend. So, with that kind of being said, we'd idealistically expect Stephen Furtick to be paid, if he has 2,600, 800, a million. We could feasibly, just by these numbers. I'm not saying Stephen Furtick, which is the pastor of Elevation Church, gets paid $1 million a year in his salary from the church. If he did, that would be 1% of the income of the church, because the church brought in 108 million. So that would actually be less than 1% that the income brought in. So it would still be fair, and it would actually fit in the general statistics. Are you curious to how much Stephen Furtick's salary is? And perhaps before I tell you how much Stephen Furtick's salary is, the highest paid executive director of a nonprofit is in Alabama. That nonprofit is in Alabama, and that person is paid $6 million a year plus some additional stuff. Are y'all ready for Stephen Furtick's salary? All right, it is $38,000 a year. That's how much the church pays him as a salary. Now, to be fair, likely the church may or may not contribute to his parsonage, right? Because that is a right that pastors have, in the same way. Let me get my camera back right. What? There we go. In the same way that chancellors or presidents of colleges also have that. And there's some other institutions that also have that ability as well. But they may or may not be financing his home, his parsonage, and if so, that would be a different thing. I actually don't think so. In this case, that they're likely subsidizing some things, but I don't think so. So his salary is 38,000, and just to kind of give some contrast there, I also had the ability to find out Joel Osteen's salary. Are you curious to what Joel Osteen's salary is from Lakewood Church? Zero. Joel Osteen does not take a salary from Lakewood, from the church. Now, this is information that is obviously not talked about a lot. And I promise you, I know many of you thinking like, bro, you zigged when you should have zagged. Trust me, I have a place that I'm going to end this at. But right now, like I said, I like to bring nuance to the conversation, and I like to make sure that we're always being as genuine as possible with our critique of things, so that we can be fair and we don't run the risk of dehumanizing people based off of misinformation. And so I know many of you are probably wondering why so low. If not, the other half of you are probably wondering, okay, how else are they really getting their money from the church? Because they're getting that money from that church somehow. And just the truth of the matter, churches are not that financially viable. And so, and when I say that, again, I refer you back to the earlier statistics of that most churches, and that doesn't even account just for mega churches. This is pretty much all churches, and pretty much most organizations are being supported financially by only 20% of the giving, the giving base. Only 20%. Only 20% of the giving base, which does mean that most churches are absolutely on a hamster wheel of keeping up, which partly answers this question of why so low. In many cases, the pastors have come to that understanding that you really can't afford to pay me, and that really becomes like it's a real issue for church planners. And Osteen is not a church planner, but his dad was, John Osteen. It's a really big issue for church planners because typically they sacrifice their lives, and we did sacrifice your lives, to follow this belief and follow this dream and invest yourself in it. There is no big money in the beginning. And, again, mega churches represent less than 5%, which means less than 5% of the people who become pastors will ever pastor a mega church, which means, 95% of pastors are pastoring a struggling church, and 95% of churches are, in a sense, struggling to some degree, because regardless of the size they are, they're typically only being supported by 20% of the people. It's funny because, and this was absolutely common upon, in the circles that I was in, is that pastoral compensation seems to go on a spectrum from 0 to 0, as from the church. So in the beginning, pastors are either bivocational church planners, rather, pastors who started their churches from the ground up. They're either bivocational or by faith. Right. That's how church planners start. They are either bivocational or by faith, which means they are subsisted on another way to pay their bills so that they can freely serve the church, or they are freely serving the church, believing that God is going to, work a miracle on their behalf. Bivocational, by faith. Church planners spend a long time in that area, because it does take a long time to somewhat build churches. Even when they grow fast, sometimes they don't grow fast until after 15 years of not growing. This is like real stuff. But so that pastor then will typically will start with a modest salary, you know, once the church starts growing a little bit, because by this time the church has racked up a lot of debt, a lot of bills, typically associated again with campus debt and equipment. Equipment is a big one. That media thing, right? And of course, just paying other people. Churches will take out loans to pay staff sometimes, and they'll just try to do as much as they can to stay afloat. And so it'll start with the modest salary. Then they hit that high season where they're the it church. Everybody in within the region kind of knows about their church, has heard about them. At this moment, they officially become the church where there are rumors spread about them, where you have to give your income tax to be a member of those churches. And quite honestly, that is mostly not true of non-denominational urban churches. That is typically more true of more traditional established churches that have a legacy of 100 years or more, whose churches operate as more of a social club than a outreach ministry. And those churches are really easy to spot. So you're pretty much at that level now, and you're doing kind of well. And many, I don't want to say most, but many pastors do in that time do begin to take on an exorbitant salary, right? At that time, they're getting some notoriety, some visibility. The church is growing, and a little bit of this is payback. It's like, and I'm just being honest and telling you how many of them may feel, and that is, hey, you kind of owe me. Like, I sacrificed a lot, I did a lot to make this work. I stressed out about this stuff while y'all didn't have to, and it's more than just me preaching the fantasy. I got to keep this building afloat and all this stuff. So it's a lot, and a lot of pastors do go through that payback phase of just like, pay me what you owe me. But it is typically minuscule by comparison, because by that time they're still newly minted into this mega world, and so they still don't even know what real money is in many cases. So they've just boosted their salary by an extra $15,000 or $20,000, or they've officially moved their housing on the parsonage, or the church is covering their vehicles or something like that. So you do have some things of that nature. But then typically after that, especially again, these are for the high performing mega churches, they start getting a lot of speaking engagements. They start getting a lot of book sales. They start getting a lot of gifts. They start making music. I know that's one of the things that Ferdix Church does, that Elevation does. And then they typically start investing in other businesses, such as real estate and media companies. That's very big for mega churches, for mega church pastors. Almost all of them have a real estate company and a media company, or more of them. And so typically once they get that point and they realize that them actually trying to have the church pay them is not only a strain on the church, but it's also at the point where it's unnecessary. And it also gives them that place of spiritual superiority of where they get to say, oh, it finally worked. I sacrificially gave all of these years, and now I can be the biggest giver to the church by forfeiting my salary to the church. And many of them do make that decision. And I think that is something that should be talked about, because there are not many other nonprofit organization leaders who have just as many outsiding networks that do that. You know, I don't even know if we've had a president to forego their salary yet. But anyway, so what is the problem, Darante? Because you just spent a lot of time talking us through some things that just sounds like this is just really an organization that operates like most other organizations. And that is absolutely true. This is the mega church is an organization that operates like most organizations that are of its size, scale, and impact. And many of these churches don't just have influence on their local cities, but also, across the nation. And many of them have work, in other globes and things, in other globes, and other countries and other continents. And so they are leading these massive organizations. And so, to me, outside of the superstition, I don't have much problem with how the mega churches run, because I'll be honest with you, I've been a part of the mega churches, and I've been a part of the smaller churches. And for me, where a lot of, because, and I'll say it this way, because more people are members of the smaller churches. There are more smaller churches. There are more churches. And when I say small churches, I'm definitely talking about these churches that are 1,000 and under. There are more churches where the pastor is their God. And that's scary, but there is a problem with megachurch money. There is a problem with megachurch wealth. And this is why I wanted to get all of that out in the beginning and walk you through it. And I hope I didn't lose you. And if I did, so be it, because I want to have conversations with people where we can discuss nuances of things without people feeling, well, if that's not what I thought about it, so I don't want to hear it. And it's like, well, those are the things we have to break. Unless you actually have insight into it, unless you've actually had experience with it to attach your opinions to, then your opinions are only supported by narratives, which may or may not be false, and in many cases are at the very least misinformed. And so what I like to do on my channel is try to highlight some of the issues that, because the misinformed narratives take precedence, some of the real dangers actually get overlooked. And so I want to highlight that. The first is the association of wealth as the blessing or approval of God. That's, I mean, like that to me is like the biggest elephant in the room. Even if you sincerely believe this, and I did, as a very, very broke person, I believed that wealth, especially in the church realm, if you were a pastor and you were wealthy, and you were wealthy from pastoring, it was because God had approved you. God was proud of the work you were doing and had shown you favor. Um, but even if you sincerely believe this, it's highly irresponsible and often leads to overlooking very real red flags on the play, because after all, that person is approved by God, you know which then kind of makes it a little difficult for members when a pastor does say something, or even not even just a pastor, but someone on television who's a wealthy televangelist says, God told me that somebody out there is supposed to give a seed of $12,500, and this person goes on to describe a situation that sounds like yours, because it likely sounds like 90% of other Americans, but it gives you a situation that sounds like yours. You're more prone to believe that this person is speaking from some type of special insight and some type of special relationship with God, and that you should adhere to it. And then this is also incredibly dehumanizing to members who are not wealthy, as the existing inference is then that they are not approved, right? If wealth then is a sign that God has blessed me, then poverty is a sign that God has forsaken me, either because I haven't done something right or just because he's a jackass. But either way, that those are the feelings that you lead to. And then, of course, This is going to create a culture where people feel like they have to keep up with the Joneses to show that they are still in favor with God. Because if at any moment they look like they have fallen out of favor with God by falling on financial hard times, they are ultimately then distanced from other people in these churches. And so, while I did highlight the fact that that a lot of the or a significant portion of the revenue of megachurches does come from those angel donors, those celebrity and high profile and very successful professionals that are minority members of their churches, I think one of the things that does need to be pointed out is that, yes, even though that's the case, while these pastors are preaching these messages of that, this wealth is associated with the blessing of God, they're not doing anything to corral, to I'll put it this way. The wealthy people who are typically giving to mega churches were wealthy before they became members of mega churches. It was nothing that the mega church did that helped them become wealthy unless they're another pastor. And I think that that's a conversation that needs to be had. All right, I'm going to move on because I've been going for a little bit. My notes popped all the way up. Let me come back down here. So there's also the association of wealth as a cause and effect for giving, often sacrificially. So seed, time, and harvest. If you sow this seed, then God is going to give it back to you. And many of the pastors, again, and I try to keep this nuance in here. Many of the pastors, not all, but many of the pastors absolutely believe that a part of their wealth is because they have been sacrificial givers, their entire ministries. That's that inner voice, that inner dialogue that they run. So when they're teaching this to their members, they think that they're teaching their members a solid strategy, because after all, it worked for me. Not only did I sacrifice my time and my money to build this church, I also gave offerings to some big name when it didn't make any sense to me. And look at me now. And so, yes, there is some correlation here, but there is not causation, which is necessary for cause and effect. And so this places families who are often living around or beneath the poverty line, who desperately want to participate in the blessings of God. This places them in a really places them between a rock and a hard place, often forcing them to have to go to such extremes as using rent money as an offering to gain God's favor, hoping that, okay, maybe if I sow this seed, which by my practical reasoning says, well, if I give this money to the church, then I'm going to be behind on my rent and I may get kicked out. But maybe God wants to work a miracle in my life that doesn't make any sense, and so I should give my rent money to the church, and God will see my heart, and then he will finally open up the floodgates of heaven and pour out a blessing on me and my struggling family who's living in poverty. I don't think we actually wrestle with the psychological damage. The financial damage, you can count the cost. I know when I was a believer, I did. When I was a believer, I did. I count the cost. Every time I gave a seed, I knew the risk that I was taking. I never understood the risk I was taking cognitively by exposing myself to these ideologies as true and accepting them without evidence. Another thing is, you're robbing your members of a truth you practice by not being transparent by how you built your wealth, keeping it all under the cover of God did it. Just as a brief rabbit trail, I remember this began to annoy me heavily in the past 10 years that I was active in ministry, because I was a part of a lot of church leader conferences, specifically the ones targeted towards church growth. And so these conferences are targeted towards pastors with smaller churches who have typically started their churches and are likely in storefronts or hand-me-down buildings, and are trying to figure out strategy, whether it's prayer strategy or corporate strategy, to grow their churches and to make their churches relevant. And in many of these conferences, you get a little bit of practical information, which is pretty much anything you could have read in most books on hospitality, or almost any books on industrial organizational psychology, and with absolute much better appeal, because the information is typically very, very watered down, not just because the people are trying to hide it, which I'm going to hit that in a few, but because the people themselves are not always capable of understanding it, because they've become so used to being echoes of information that there really is no qualification, or there really is no requirement on themselves to actually understand the information that they spout out. That's the role of a preacher, because I'm not leaning to my own understanding. I don't have to understand this. I just have to believe that is true. And as long as I believe that is true, I can say it. And so that moves beyond just the word of God, but also other things as well. So you hear another pastor say, this is how you grow your church. Then you're just going to, echo that. And so that's what happened in a lot of these places. But one of the things that I found to be absolutely disingenuous is that many pastors would give these little things that, again, like I said, were just small things, like, oh, the name of the church, and dress urban and hip and stuff like that, which none of these things actually grow a community or a church at all. But they all have this story, that can't nobody do it but God, like, and at the end of the day, it'll only be God, and to be honest with you, when I look back over the years, I don't know how it happened. I don't know how it got here. I can just give you some things that I've learned along the way, but ultimately just hope that God's favor is on your life. You see that favor thing again? Which is of course incredibly problematic for me, because many times these pastors who've come to hear, you've marketed them to them on this ideology that I'm about to give you the keys to revolutionize your church. After you leave here, you're going to know exactly how to take your church from this level to the next level. But then you get them in the conference after they've paid anywhere between $500 to $1,200 to get there, not including all of the offerings that are going to be taken up, and the big offering that's typically taken up on the last night of the conference, where you're going to do the money lines, which, I'm not going to necessarily harp on churches for doing money lines, because again, all institutions that participate in fundraisings do have money lines. The difference between the churches is that the churches add the voice of God to the money line. You know, when you go to an alumni or alumni gala or dinner gala or a political gala, they're also going to ask, if anybody wants to donate, $25,000, here's this line. But they're not going to say, hey, the Spirit of the Lord just told me that somebody out there is holding on to that $25,000 and God said, let it go. Instead, they'll more likely, just being an MC, I feel like somebody got some more money out there and you don't want to let it go. Do you see how it's acceptable on one sense and not acceptable on the other sense? And again, that's the nuance that I think we should hone in on, lest we do ourselves a disservice. Again, that's why these messages don't really hit home when you're trying to tell Christians that, hey, you might be taken advantage of. It's because, the information that you're giving them in most cases is information that's either not accurate or out of context. But then once you start realizing the real issues, you're like, holy shit, that may have been a red herring all along. That information may have been planted by Christian mega pastors to keep us from finding out where the real problems are. But anyway, back to it. You get this idea of pastors who have these people paying all of this money to come to these services, marketing them under the idea of saying, I'm going to tell you how to grow your church. And then once you get there, it's, well, I really don't know how it happened. I don't know how it happened. Now tell me that doesn't sound like a toddler lying. I don't know how it happened, mama. But so, and then this other one, and I'm closing up here, is an implicit need for a financial hierarchy, a system that attaches wealth to the blessing of God or the favor of a divine being who just so happens to be the creator and the orchestrator of the entire world, including everything that's happening on planet Earth, creates a need for a financial hierarchy. If wealth is a sign of the blessing of God and a sacrificial lifestyle, then the pastor has a vested interest in keeping financial distance between he he or her or they and their leaders. That's the best way to do that. The pastor has a vested interest in keeping financial distance between them and their leaders, and their leaders and their volunteers, thereby reinforcing a need to kind of hide somewhat of a secret recipe, because the idea comes in, and I'm going to use scripture here, that the oil that is on the head flows down. The oil flows from the head down. And in this case, if wealth is attached to the blessing of God, then that ideology is that wealth flows from the head down. And so for the pastor to continue to be seen as the one who has the blessing of God, the undisputed blessing of the Lord, for the pastor to be continually be perceived as the one who has that undisputed blessing, who has that superior blessing that is flowing down to other people, he has to keep financial distance, or is at least tempted to keep financial distance between themselves and other people at their church, lest they run the risk of looking like they no longer have the favor of God, which this is the second time I've highlighted that in this conversation as a real issue, not just amongst the pastors, but even amongst the believers. And this is not a new issue. This issue was noted even by Marcus Garvey when dealing with the black community in the 1910s and 1920s. And so it almost becomes, I don't know if you've seen Wolf of Wall Street. I cannot remember the main character's name now. I do know it, but can't remember it now. But it's played by Leonardo DiCaprio. He says, they got to want to live like me. And that really does become the mode of living for many pastors, is that I got to kind of stay wealthy and stay ahead because they got to want what I want to kind of stay bought into this idea. And as, again, just hearing me talk about that, you can easily see how that's not something restricted to just the church world, right? But I'm going to hit this last one and then just go ahead and close out here. And this is probably the biggest one to me as a person who is truly passionate about community, and that is the failure to maximize investment. All right. I know there's a different route. I've been zigging and zagging all over the place. But this is me, and I'm not asking anybody to share my beliefs or to share my ideas or to share my perceptions. And that's ultimately what they are. They're not necessarily beliefs, they're perceptions, and they are subject to change. But to me, the failure to maximize investment is probably the biggest tragedy here when dealing with megachurch money. Because at the end of the day, megachurches are communities, and community is an investment in people. It is the people's share with you, the megachurch pastor, that allows you, enabled your liberty, not only to serve them in meaningful ways, but to gain visibility and opportunity through that service. That service that you did for them, but also for yourself, if we're being absolutely honest, and also sponsored by them. That opportunity, even if you have given your salary back, and I find that to be absolutely amazing. That's beautiful to me. But even if you have given your salary back, what I like for us to look at when we're dealing with the megachurch pastors is I want you to think about the opportunity that has been given to these megachurch pastors based off of how their churches have sponsored them. We talked about the book sales and the music sales and the speaking engagements. Yes, that's out there. And many of these pastors are wise enough to still give their church percentages of those things, which is, again, I find to be absolutely honorable. But the real opportunity that those pastors have been given, that have been sponsored by their church members or the church community, is access to financial advisors, book publishers, marketing teams, business managers, and etc. that they're not making available to the membership. if anyone is curious, do a survey if you can, if you have the tools to, on how many independent authors are members of churches where the pastor is a best-selling author, and yet that church has never made his publishing team, or that pastor has never made his publishing team available to his church. And I'm not saying he needs to, or they need to make sure all of their members are, hey, all of my members need a book deal. I'm not saying that. But the advice and guidance that megachurch pastors get from their church-sponsored personal teams is worth more than any Sunday sermon or big-ticket preacher. Yet that's the information that they choose to keep from their members. Those are the moves they choose to keep covered under. It was nobody but God. Those are the moves that they hide by saying, baby, I don't know how that happened. That was nothing but God. While they have these entire teams, these engines, if you will, who are at work, navigating the world on their behalf without superstition. Yet that's the information that they choose to keep from their members. That's the team that they choose to keep from their members. They invite all of their preacher friends to preach and to raise offerings, but very few of them will bring in the people they actually trust with their own trajectory. Because I'm going to tell you something about preacher friends. They're not taking advice from each other. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's not how that works. So even though they're putting them up on the platform and telling you, oh man, these people have a great word, they're not interested in that word. They take the advice of the teams that those churches have, or that those churches and the opportunity of serving with those churches have paid for. And the greatest criminality here, in my opinion, is that opportunity that those churches have made available for those pastors have not done well to make available for the members of those churches. If you're looking for the imbalance of ethics, I just gave you the only smoking gun that matters. I hope you were able to pull something from this conversation. I know this is a long one, but this is one that I've been wanting to talk about for a little bit, just to share some of those nuances. Again, so that we can stop flocking to the red herrings and actually address the issues in a way that's actually going to resonate with people, and may even lead to some type of tangible and progressive change. So again, thank you all for hanging out with me today. I love y'all so much. I appreciate all of the support that we get on the channel. If you haven't already, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit that alert notification bell. Consider joining this community in whatever way makes sense for you. Consider supporting this community and channel in whatever way that makes sense for you, and check out the merch. Thank y'all for hanging out with me. Until next time, keep rising, stay progressive, and you already know, stay beautiful if you can. I'll holla.